Every breakthrough starts with someone who refuses to stay on the ground, and this story is packed with the women who did exactly that. From the first shaky liftoffs on dirt runways to roaring engines ripping through the stratosphere, every chapter shows how they pushed harder, climbed higher, and proved that limits are just suggestions. If you think flight was built on calm skies and easy victories, think again, because this journey is all turbulence, grit, and sky-breaking ambition. So buckle in, tighten your harness, and get ready, because once these women take off, they rewrite everything. The moment their wheels leave the earth, the sky was never meant to be theirs. At least, that's what the world once believed. Before rockets and moon landings, before jets screamed across the horizon, there were women who looked up and dared to dream. They saw freedom where others saw danger, and possibility where society saw boundaries. They climbed into fragile machines stitched from wood and canvas, chasing something greater than approval, the right to fly. This is the story of those who defied gravity and expectations alike. Their courage forged wings of steel, and in their flight, they rewrote the limits of the sky itself. In the early years of the 20th century, humanity was just beginning to conquer the air. The Wright brothers lifted off the sands of Kitty Hawk, and newspapers called it a miracle. Yet as men raced to claim the title of aviator, women were told their place was firmly on the ground. The age of flight had begun, but for women, the runway seemed closed. Still, curiosity stirred in those who refused to accept the rules. They watched the engines roar and thought, "Why not me?" Harriet Quimby stood among them. A writer, dreamer, and relentless spirit, she earned her pilot's license in 1911, becoming the first American woman to do so. The press loved her daring style, flying in a purple satin suit, but dismissed her skill as novelty. Harriet proved them wrong when she flew solo across the English Channel, a feat even many men had never attempted. She didn't seek fame. She sought equality in the air, and her courage inspired others to follow her path. Across the Atlantic, Raymond de la Roche became the first licensed female pilot in the world. Her flights above France drew crowds both awed and doubtful. "A woman flying a machine?" they whispered. Yet Raymond's calm control silenced every doubt. She flew for love of the sky, not for spectacle, and every takeoff was a statement of defiance. These early aviators faced more than mechanical risks. They fought ridicule, exclusion, and danger at every turn. Airfields were not built for them, and aircraft were rarely offered to them. They begged, borrowed, and built their way into the air. Many lost their lives testing fragile planes that barely held together, but their determination never wavered. The public watched with fascination, torn between admiration and disbelief. Newspapers printed their pictures under headlines like "Lady Birdmen" and "Daring Damsels of the Air," turning courage into novelty. But beneath those condescending words, history was quietly changing. Each flight marked a crack in the wall that kept women grounded. By the 1920s, the movement had taken flight. More women earned licenses, taught themselves mechanics, and organized flying clubs. They gathered not to prove themselves better, but to prove they belonged. Aviation had become a symbol of freedom, a rebellion against every voice that said no. The roar of their engines echoed louder than the doubts that tried to silence them. The age of women in flight had begun. What started as a handful of dreamers was becoming a global movement. The sky, once reserved for men, was beginning to open. And with every flight, the world was forced to look up and see them there. The 1930s arrived with the hum of propellers and the thrill of competition. The world was falling in love with the idea of flight, and women, no longer content to watch from the sidelines, were ready to take command. In hangars and open fields, they prepared for challenges that would test not only their skill, but their place in history. Among them stood Amelia Earhart, a woman whose name would soon become a legend. Amelia was not the first woman to fly, but she became the symbol of what flight could mean. With her leather jacket, calm smile, and endless courage, she embodied freedom itself. When she crossed the Atlantic in 1932, alone in a Lockheed Vega, she joined the ranks of Charles Lindbergh, but her victory carried deeper meaning. For women everywhere, Amelia proved that the sky did not belong to one gender. It belonged to those brave enough to reach for it. Her fame was not built on spectacle, but persistence. She flew through storms, battled exhaustion, and faced doubts that echoed louder than engines. Reporters questioned why she risked her life, and Amelia always answered the same way. Because adventure is worthwhile. To her, each flight was more than a record. It was a step toward equality. But Amelia's legacy would also carry mystery. In 1937, she set out to circle the globe, a journey meant to prove how far human ingenuity had come. Somewhere over the Pacific, her voice faded into static and then silence. The world mourned her loss, yet her disappearance only deepened her legend. She became the eternal aviator, frozen in time, still chasing the horizon. While Amelia captured headlines, thousands of other women were quietly shaping the course of aviation. When war broke out, the call for pilots grew louder, and this time, women answered. Across America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, they stepped forward to fly, not for fame, but for duty. In the United States, the Women Air Force Service pilots, known as the WASP, formed under the guidance of Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Love. They were civilians who flew military aircraft, ferrying new planes from factories to air bases, testing repaired bombers, and training male cadets. Though they wore no medals and held no rank, they flew every kind of aircraft, from nimble fighters to heavy bombers. Their flights were dangerous, often without instruments or backup, yet they carried themselves with quiet professionalism. When male pilots doubted them, they simply flew higher. In Britain, the Air Transport Auxiliary, or ATA, filled the same vital role. Women pilots delivered Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Lancaster bombers across the foggy skies of wartime England. Among them was Amy Johnson, already famous before the war as a record-setting pilot. She flew missions with the same bravery that once broke speed records, until one stormy day in 1941 her plane vanished into the Thames estuary. Her loss was a reminder that war spared no hero, regardless of gender. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, a different kind of legend was born. The Germans called them the Night Witches, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, young women flying outdated biplanes made of wood and fabric. They flew at night, cutting their engines before diving on targets to drop bombs in near silence. The whisper of their wings terrified enemy soldiers below. These women endured freezing air, primitive equipment, and the constant threat of death. Yet they flew more than 30,000 missions during the war. Their courage earned them respect and even fear across the front. World War II became a proving ground that no one had expected. Women who had once been told to stay home now delivered bombers, trained recruits, and fought in the skies. Their contributions were undeniable, even if official recognition lagged behind. When peace returned, many were told to give up their wings, to return to families and kitchens. But something irreversible had happened. They had proven, beyond question, that skill and bravery knew no gender. In those years, women in flight transformed from novelty to necessity. They were no longer curiosities in satin flying suits or side notes in men's histories. They had carried the burden of war on their shoulders and held steady at the controls when the world needed them most. The war had shown what they always knew, that their place was wherever the horizon called. By the late 1940s, the roar of aircraft engines no longer sounded the same. It carried echoes of names once overlooked: Earhart, Cochran, Johnson, Litviak, Raskova. Each one had carved a path through prejudice and danger, leaving behind contrails of courage. The sky, once a closed kingdom, had been opened by their hands. The world was changing, and though peace had grounded many of them, their legacy could not be contained. The women of the air had proven themselves indispensable. The question was no longer whether they could fly. The question was how far they would go next. The war had ended, and with it, the world tried to return to normal. But for women who had flown through fire and risked their lives for victory, the word normal felt hollow. Many were told to hang up their flight jackets, to step aside and let the men reclaim the skies. Bases closed their doors, airlines turned them away, and newspapers forgot their names. Yet the spark could not be extinguished. They had tasted freedom in its purest form, and they would not surrender it. In post-war America and Europe, the 1950s dawned with gleaming optimism. The world celebrated peace and prosperity, but for female aviators, it was an age of quiet struggle. The same women who had ferried bombers now found themselves grounded, dismissed as wartime necessities rather than true pilots. Many became flight instructors, mechanics, or engineers, keeping their passion alive through persistence. They watched as the jet age took shape, determined not to be left behind. Jacqueline Cochran, once commander of the Wasp, refused to fade into history. She turned her focus to record-breaking. Competing directly with men, she set new speed and altitude records, pushing herself to the edge of human endurance. In 1953, she became the first woman to break the sound barrier, flying a Canadair F-86 Sabre at more than 650 miles per hour. The boom of her supersonic flight echoed as a defiant reminder that women could still lead the race for the sky. But the golden age of flight was shifting towards something even greater. The space race had begun, and the horizon no longer stopped at the edge of Earth. As the Soviet Union and the United States competed for dominance beyond the atmosphere, women once again stood ready, though the gates to this new frontier remained shut. In the early 1960s, 13 American women underwent a secret series of astronaut tests. They were pilots, doctors, and scientists, each one as qualified as the men in NASA's Mercury program. They became known as the Mercury 13. They passed every test, matching or surpassing the men in endurance and isolation trials. But when the time came to fly, they were denied. Congress dismissed the idea of women astronauts, calling spaceflight a man's domain. The program was quietly ended, and history nearly forgot their names. Across the ocean, the Soviet Union took a different path. In 1963, Valentina Tereshkova, a former textile worker and amateur skydiver, became the first woman in space. Her flight aboard Vostok 6 lasted nearly 3 days and orbited the Earth 48 times. She returned not just as a cosmonaut, but as a symbol. The Soviets hailed her as proof of equality under socialism, but beyond politics, her achievement carried universal meaning. For every woman who had ever been told to stay grounded, Valentina's voice from orbit said otherwise. The decades that followed were years of turbulence and transition. As the world modernized, so did the fight for gender equality. Aviation schools slowly began to open their doors to more women, though the journey remained steep. Female flight attendants were celebrated, but female pilots were still questioned. Airlines often claimed passengers wouldn't trust a woman at the controls. Women answered with patience, persistence, and performance. By the 1970s, the sound of change was unmistakable. Civil rights movements swept across nations, and the feminist wave reached every profession, including aviation. Women began to join commercial airlines as pilots for the first time in modern history. In 1973, Emily Howell Warner became the first female pilot hired by a major U.S. airline, breaking a barrier that had stood for nearly half a century. Others followed in her wake, proving that the cockpit was not a man's throne but a place for skill and discipline alone. In the military, progress was slower but inevitable. As technology advanced and aircraft grew faster, stronger, and deadlier, women began to re-enter the conversation about combat flight. Their experiences in the past wars could no longer be ignored. The persistence of pioneers like Cochran, Tereshkova, and the Mercury 13 inspired a generation of girls who now looked skyward without hesitation. The world had entered the jet age, an era of power and possibility. Women were once again climbing into the seats of machines that touched the edge of space. Each flight was a declaration, each mission a step closer to equality. And though they faced the same resistance their predecessors had known, their determination burned brighter. By the close of the 1970s, the barriers that had held women back for decades began to crack. Laws changed. Attitudes shifted. And somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of rockets hinted that the next frontier was waiting. The women of the air had fought for their place through war, prejudice, and silence. Now, they stood at the threshold of something even greater, the dawn of an age where the sky was no longer the limit. By the dawn of the 1980s, the dream that began with fragile biplanes had reached the edge of space. The generation that once looked up at Amelia Earhart now looked beyond the clouds to the stars. The barriers that had confined women to the ground were cracking, though not yet gone. Opportunity was spreading, and with it came a new wave of pioneers ready to claim their place among the stars. In 1983, a quiet and brilliant physicist named Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. Aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, she served as mission specialist, operating the robotic arm that deployed satellites. Her calm confidence inspired millions of girls who saw, perhaps for the first time, that space was not just a man's arena. When reporters asked her whether a woman could handle the pressures of flight, she smiled and said, "It's too bad our society isn't yet past that question." With that, she redefined what it meant to be an astronaut. But Sally Ride was not the first woman to reach orbit. That honor still belonged to Valentina Tereshkova, who 2 decades earlier had already broken the barrier of space itself. Between them stretched a bridge of perseverance, proof that women around the world, despite systems, cultures, and politics, shared the same dream of flight without limits. Their courage was mirrored by others who would soon follow. In the Soviet Union, Svetlana Savitskaya became the first woman to walk in space, wielding tools and confidence in equal measure. Her presence aboard the Salyut 7 station marked another milestone, demonstrating that women were not guests in space, they were essential members of its future. In Japan, Chiaki Mukai blazed her own trail, becoming her country's first female astronaut and traveling on 2 space shuttle missions. Her achievements helped shift cultural expectations in a nation where tradition often confined women's ambitions to the ground. While astronauts made history above, women continued to fight for recognition below. In military hangars and commercial cockpits, they faced doubts and discrimination that echoed through decades. Yet progress was unstoppable. The U.S. military began opening flight schools to women in the late 1970s, and by the 1980s, the first generation of female fighter pilots was in training. These aviators flew supersonic jets, commanding aircraft that once symbolized exclusion. They proved not only capable, but exceptional, flying missions and earning respect through precision and composure. Eileen Collins stood among them. A test pilot and astronaut, she broke through 2 barriers at once, first as the pilot of a space shuttle, then as its commander. In 1999, when she led the Columbia mission into orbit, she became the first woman to command a space shuttle. Calm, methodical, and unflinchingly professional, she represented the culmination of decades of struggle and sacrifice. From the Wasp to Mercury 13, every woman who had been told no could finally see their dream reflected in her flight. As the century turned, the faces of aviation and space exploration began to change. Female astronauts, engineers, and scientists became part of every mission. In 2019, Jessica Meir and Christina Koch conducted the first all-female spacewalk, a moment that resonated far beyond the orbit of Earth. Their voices, carried over radio waves from hundreds of kilometers above, echoed the legacy of every woman who had once looked up and wondered what lay beyond the sky. On the ground, airlines that once refused female pilots now depended on them. Women captained international flights, trained cadets, and managed fleets. Military air forces across the world introduced female squadrons, and many nations appointed their first women generals of aviation. The horizon that once seemed unreachable had expanded into something boundless. Technology changed too. Drones, rockets, and new spacecraft blurred the line between air and space, and women were there at every stage, designing, piloting, and commanding. They no longer had to prove they belonged. Their presence had become proof in itself. The journey from the Wright brothers' sandy dunes to orbiting laboratories was no longer just a story of machines. It was a story of humanity, perseverance, and the refusal to accept limits. The new millennium brought fresh challenges and new possibilities. Programs to send astronauts to Mars and explore deep space included women from the start. Aviation evolved into aerospace, and the same courage that once carried Quimby, Earhart, and Cochrane through the clouds now carried a new generation toward the stars. Each mission carried echoes of the past, voices whispering through the silence of the void, reminding them that the sky was never a ceiling, only a beginning. From cockpit to cosmos, the story of women in flight had become one of endurance and evolution. They had transformed from forbidden dreamers to leaders of discovery. The engines may have changed, but the purpose never did. Each takeoff was a continuation of a promise that courage knows no boundary, and the sky no end. The horizon had always been their destination. From canvas wings to titanium fuselages, from rickety airfields to the boundless dark of orbit, women had carved their legacy into the very air itself. But as the 21st century unfolded, their story was no longer just one of defiance. It had become a story of belonging, of mastery, and of inheritance. What once required rebellion now demanded leadership. The daughters of the pioneers were not asking for permission anymore. They were charting the future. Airports and spaceports alike now echo with the footsteps of women who stand where others once dreamed to be. The sight of a woman in uniform, walking confidently toward a cockpit, is no longer unusual. Yet each stride carries the weight of generations who fought for that simple normalcy. The laughter of young cadets, the calm professionalism of captains, the intensity of astronauts in training, all of it is built on foundations laid by names that history once tried to forget. They are test pilots and engineers, air traffic controllers and designers, mechanics and mission leaders. Their hands guide machines once thought impossible, and their minds design the ones that will take humanity further still. Whether in the hangars of Houston or the laboratories of Moscow, the desert training fields of Arizona or the orbital simulators of Tokyo, women now occupy every corner of the sky's domain. They do not chase the dream of equality anymore. They live it. But even now, the journey is not finished. For every woman who commands a flight deck, there are others still fighting to be seen. For every country that celebrates its first female astronaut, there are many where girls are still told not to dream of flight. Progress may have spread its wings, but the air remains uneven. The courage of those who flew before serves as both inspiration and reminder. Freedom, once earned, must always be protected. The stories of the past linger in the wind. Amelia's steady smile before takeoff. Harriet Quimby's purple suit glinting in the sun. The night witches gliding through the dark, engines silent, hearts unshaken. Jackie Cochran's hands gripping the controls as she broke the sound barrier. Sally Ride floating weightless, her voice calm, as Earth rolled beneath her. These images are more than memories. They are chapters of a legacy written not in ink, but in altitude. The sky itself remembers them. Every contrail stretching white across the blue is a line of history, an echo of someone who refused to yield. Every pilot who climbs through the clouds carries, whether they know it or not, the spirit of those who came before. It is in the rhythm of the engines, the silence before takeoff, the first moment when gravity lets go. Today, girls grow up seeing pilots who look like them, astronauts whose names they can pronounce, heroes who tell them that the impossible is only another kind of altitude. They learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to fly anyway. They learn that the sound of progress is not applause, but the steady hum of engines cutting through resistance. They learn that the sky, once forbidden, now waits for their command. Aviation and space exploration continue to evolve, and with every advancement comes another opportunity to redefine what it means to fly. Unmanned drones, supersonic airliners, reusable rockets, and missions to Mars. Each new frontier calls for voices and minds shaped by diversity. Women lead research into propulsion, helm international space agencies, and captain aircraft across continents. The struggle that began as a whisper has become a chorus, and the world can no longer pretend not to hear it. Yet beyond the technology and achievement, there remains the same simple wonder that drove the first aviators into the air. The heartbeat that quickens before flight. The deep breath before the wheels lift from the earth. The infinite quiet above the clouds where everything seems possible. That feeling has not changed in over a century. It is the same wonder that united every pilot, every engineer, every dreamer who ever looked upward and thought, "What if I could?" The women who fly today honor that question with every takeoff. They do not see themselves as exceptions, but as part of an unbroken line. When they cross oceans, circle the globe, or soar beyond the atmosphere, they carry more than passengers or instruments. They carry history itself. The courage of the first generation, the persistence of the second, the brilliance of the third. all converge in the hum of their engines. One day soon, a woman will set foot on Mars. She will plant a flag not just for her nation, but for every soul who ever dared to leave the ground. Somewhere, her flight will echo the same determination that once carried Amelia Earhart into the clouds, or Valentina Tereshkova into orbit. And when she speaks, her words will remind the world that the sky was never the limit. It was only the beginning. The story of women in flight is not about defying men or conquering gravity. It is about human possibility. It is about the will to rise above expectation, to risk everything for a dream that cannot be contained. It is about the belief that courage is stronger than prejudice, that wings are earned not by permission but by persistence. As the engines fade and the stars emerge, their legacy remains, bright and enduring. From the fragile biplanes of the past to the spacecraft of tomorrow, the message is clear: the sky has no ceiling. Their journey continues wherever a young girl looks up and feels that pull in her chest, that quiet whisper to go higher. Every generation inherits that whisper. Some hear it as a challenge, others as a promise. For the women who first dared to fly, it was both. They broke the silence of centuries and replaced it with the roar of engines, the rush of wind, and the certainty that freedom can be found between Earth and stars. Their wings were not made of metal alone, but of resolve, courage, and belief. And so their story lives on. In the laughter of flight school students, in the hands that build rockets, in the voices that count down to launch, in the endless sky, still waiting for the next dreamer to rise. The women who took flight against the odds proved that no boundary is final. They showed the world that destiny, like flight, belongs to those who dare to lift off.